Hello, tanks and tankheads, and welcome to Scotland. Yeah, it's a beautiful Scottish summer, can't you tell? I'm actually this is not World of Tanks. This is not Armoured Warfare, but that's what I'm going to be talking about today. What I'm actually going to be playing while I'm talking about it, however, is a game I picked up on the Steam Summer Sale because reasons. It's Train Simulator 2015, yes, and that is in fact a rather famous British steam train indeed, or at least it's one of a rather famous class. It's one of the Nigel Gresley designed LNER class A4 Pacifics, and this is actually the train that's called Sir Nigel Gresley. Now, Train Sim 2015, holy cow, the DLC is real. You can spend literally thousands of euros on the DLC that's available for this game. I bought on sale three things. I bought the base game, which comes with I think 4 or 5 trains plus 2 or possibly 3 different routes. I actually bought a route add-on, which is this one. It's the West Highland line, and you'll possibly recognise a bit of it towards the end of this particular journey. And I also bought the train pack, the A4 Pacific train pack, and it actually comes with the all 6 survivors, all 6 preserved A4s, including this one. So you can actually play the Mallard, you can play the Bittern, the Dwight D. Eisenhower, even. I almost said Eisenhower there, that's the word. Wow, we're off to a good start. And the Union of Canada and the Union of South Africa, and there might be another one I've forgotten there, but anyway, these are the ones that you can play, and they've all got different liveries from different periods, although having looked up a little bit of information, they all appear to be as they were in the kind of the 50s, the late-ish 50s, because the interesting thing about these trains is that they served right up until the end of the use of steam on the British rail network, even though they were first designed in the 1930s, so they had a pretty long lifespan compared to a lot of steam locomotives. But they're also just gorgeous. I mean, they are some of the best looking steam trains ever produced. And they were actually inspired by a streamlined German diesel train that I can't remember the name of, but it was nicknamed the Flying Hamburger. You can guess it was something to do with the city of Hamburg. But Nigel Gresley was inspired to, partially at least by those, to create these trains, which were supposed to be, you know, high-speed express trains. And I've actually gone with a rake of 7 rather old-fashioned looking BR coaches. So, in fact, are these even BR coaches? Yes, they are BR coaches. So, that's a very old BR logo. So anyway, what I'm actually going to be talking about, however, is not Train Sim at all, and it's thousands of pounds worth of DLC. It's thousands of euros. It's probably about £2,000 maybe in terms of the actual total amount. But, yeah, Armoured Warfare and World of Tanks, and it seems like a good time to do a video like this, because there's 3 particular areas where Armoured Warfare is doing something pretty different to World of Tanks. Because a lot of people have said, oh well, it's just, you know, it just looks like a clone or whatever. Well, there are a lot of very similar mechanics. A lot of, like, Armoured Warfare has positioned itself in that genre in the way that a lot of games position themselves very specifically in the World of Warcraft genre. Like, they specifically modelled themselves on that game. Well, with Armoured Warfare, they've done a couple of things that are sort of different, and they're fairly major things, and there's the 3 specific ones I'm going to be covering are artillery, the matchmaking spread, and the RNG spread. Now I'm going to start off with artillery, and obviously artillery in World of Tanks is a somewhat decisive, or divisive even, subject. Decisive is an entirely different word. Basically, World of Tanks, when it first came along, and we need a little bit of history here, when it first came along, the only vehicles that went all the way up to tier 10 were heavies. And something was needed to counter these heavies. Like, I've been playing long enough that I remember the introduction of tier 10 medium tanks. These days we think, you know, all branches going up to tier 10 is a perfectly normal thing, but it wasn't always the case. Now, it made sense back then to have something to counter the heavies, because the only thing that could really take on a tier 10 heavy was another tier 10 heavy. Let's just have a little peek out the window. And so the fact that you've got a support class, what was essentially meant to be a support class that can do that, well, you know, it makes sense in that context. Now you fast forward a bit, we get tier 10 heavies being introduced, and then a little bit, tier 10 mediums rather, and a little bit later you get tier 10 arty. Well, what were then tier 8 arty was stretched up to tier 10, basically. So it's not like they were made massively more powerful. But the thing is, at that point, they weren't really necessary in the same way, because you had high tier tank destroyers, you had high tier mediums, and you had other heavy tanks. So it's not like there wasn't anything else that could really take on the heavies at that stage. So yeah, it became a kind of a legacy thing at that point. Like, and it almost is to this day that Wargaming is perhaps hesitant to make any major changes to artillery because there are a lot of people with artillery. But the thing is, it was, and it got to be a problem. And before, was it patch 8.6? Artillery at higher tiers was basically killing the higher tiers. You would have games quite regularly where it was entirely possible to have two teams with 10 plus artillery on each side. I actually saw an anecdote on Reddit, and you know, take this with a pinch of salt because it was just an anecdote, but somebody recounting the pre-arty hardcap days and telling the, you know, posting about a battle that they'd had where it was them in a high tier medium tank, like a tier 10 medium tank. There was one tier 10 medium tank on the other team, and the other 14 vehicles per team were artillery. And it was Redshire, and what they did was basically both went and hid under the little bridge in the middle of the map, and basically just let the artillery fight it out, because they were both like, nope, screw this. We're not playing this. This isn't World of Tanks, this is World of Artillery. So it was a problem, and there have been various tweaks and changes to try and counter the problem. There was the artillery hardcap. They basically made artillery's accuracy relatively worse to everything else, and at the end of the day, it hasn't really addressed the core fundamental problem with current World of Tanks artillery gameplay, in that it isn't a support class as it stands. It's just a horrifically unreliable primary damage dealer. And I have played artillery. I've played up to tier 9 on the British artillery tree. So this frame rate, by the way, is pretty terrible. We're going between like 15 and 30. Playing it, it's a total lottery. Like, it's like playing a jackpot machine. Every time you fire, you can be aiming as best you can and playing as smart as you can, and trying to aim for areas where you know enemy tanks will be, or you might be trying to do counter artillery. But every time you click that mouse button to fire, it's a total dice roll. Like, it's by far the most RNG affected class in the entirety of the game. So for a lot of people, myself included, they find it not fun to play against, and they don't even find it fun to play just because it's so horrifically unreliable. And when you're playing against it, you know, you're getting hit by nasty high tier artillery, and it does a lot of damage. Well, there's an element of, like, those are the shots that you remember. Look at this train, by the way. This is just goddamn gorgeous. I think that the sound production in this game is a little bit meh, but the visuals, the graphics, they're pretty decent. So basically, it's kind of like its original purpose is gone, and what we're left with is a totally unsatisfactory class of vehicle. And Armoured Warfare is doing things different. You know, Armoured Warfare has come along and they've introduced a kind of like, they're initially one of the early tests. They basically did a copy paste of World of Tanks party mechanics, and everybody hated it, and it was just basically a placeholder, and everyone was like, why did you even bother? What they're doing at this point, what they've changed it to, is something like is kind of already within World of Tanks. Now, I'm specifically referring, of course, here to the Bishop and the Burt. Those kind of fast-firing, relatively low-damage artillery guns. And that is pretty much the nature of artillery in Armoured Warfare, full stop. Also, another important difference is that you don't get, at least at the moment, you don't get artillery until tier 4, so the earlier tiers are entirely free of artillery, whereas World of Tanks, the only tier that is entirely free of artillery is tier 1. If you're in a tier 1 only battle, that's fine. But nobody only wants to play tier 1, so, you know. But, yeah, the other really big major thing that they've done is, and it's actually a little bit like World of Warships as well, with carrier gameplay, artillery players in Armoured Warfare are spending at least part of their time fighting against other artillery players, and that's like carrier players. You know, if you're flying fighter planes off your carrier, you're playing against other carrier players essentially rather than the other ships. So it's kind of like a mini game within Armoured Warfare, but you get warning when somebody's firing at you with artillery, but when an artillery is also firing, if they're just sitting in the same spot firing over and over again, you get marked out for enemy artillery. Enemy arty can tell exactly where you are. If you just sit there for long enough just firing, your position will eventually be, I think it's after like 3 shots, your position is pinpoint highlighted on the minimap. Enemy artillery knows exactly where they are, only they can exactly counter-arty you. So you can't just sit in the one spot, you have to be thinking a lot more about moving around between shots, you have to be thinking about moving around to cover different areas of the map, and that's something you have to do with the Burt and the Bishop as well, is that because they have a more limited range, you have to actually think about tactical positioning, and most artillery you don't, especially. Most arty players just sit in one spot, and that's not necessarily good arty play full stop, because you can only cover certain areas of the map doing that. So that's a big, kind of almost a sea change, and Wargaming have said there was a kind of a very vague answer in one of the Q&A answers on Rita Gamer's blog, where they said, in response to, I'm sure, a lot of questions about the way arty's done in Armoured Warfare, that they would think about it, you know, that they would look at it and consider it, and that was kind of like the only answer we've had on the subject so far. So, yeah, I personally think that something a lot closer to the Armoured Warfare model would benefit World of Tanks a lot, especially because at the moment they're running a test server with, they're testing out reduced penetration values for a lot of high-tier vehicles. And the idea is they're going to make armour more relevant. But if you don't include artillery, as it is at the moment, into that equation, well, frankly, it's a waste of time, because one of the biggest threats, and I personally know this is a mouse driver, with things like the E100, having played the T28 Prot, yeah, artillery will go for you first, because you can't dodge out of the way of those artillery shots, and it's one of the reasons why we have the current meta of medium tanks are the best things to play, because medium tanks have got the best, like they've got the firepower over light tanks, but they've also got the mobility over heavy tanks, and so you're less likely to, like, you're more likely to be able to dodge out of the way of artillery shells, whereas something like a mouse, you can't just, like, somebody fires and misses and you think, oh dear, okay, I'd better relocate quickly. You can't do that. You are purely, at that point, relying on the RNG favouring you rather than the artillery player. And it's just, it's an inadequate game mechanic as it stands. It feels like it's held over from a time when it was a necessary thing in theory, and it hasn't really changed, even though the rest of the game has changed. And Wargaming's tried to kind of fudge things a bit by making it less accurate, give it longer range times, and it's kind of dancing around the core of the problem. It's not fixing the actual problem. So there we go, that's the first topic, that's artillery, and why I think artillery needs to change. I'm not saying take it out of the game entirely. I think artillery can have a place in the game, because if you took it out, there are a fair few maps where static tank destroyers would be a major problem. And honestly, like, there does need to be something to counter that. Like, if you're just sitting in the same place over and over in a tank destroyer in a bush, and much like playing artillery, you know, if you're just sitting in the same spot and that's your entire game, then artillery can be a good counter to that. But at the moment, it's too unreliable if you're going to play it. It's frustrating, and if you're playing against it, it is too devastating if you actually do get hit, if you get unlucky. And there's an issue with, you know, RNG is one of the things I'm coming to later in this video, but it is just, it's ridiculous the amount of RNG that's involved, and it does not reward skill. There is little skill compared to what else you can do in World of Tanks. And I know artillery players get very angry when they hear that, but so much of it is RNG. Like, you can be doing everything right as an artillery player. You can be aiming well, and you can be going for the targets that help your team the most, and you can be doing all the things that a good artillery player should be doing. But artillery, the sheer amount of RNG involved can just screw you so hard that you might fire, you know, like a dozen shots and none of them hit. At which point you've just been wasting your time. Why would you want to play that? So that's why it needs to change, both from perspective of, you know, people playing it and from people who play against it. Second topic, matchmaking spread. Now, if you don't know, Armoured Warfare is doing a +1, -1, but that increases if you're in the queue too long. Now, Wargaming, World of Tanks does exactly the same thing, but its kind of base is +2, -2 unless you're in Scout. There's no Scout matchmaking in Armoured Warfare, by the way. It's all +1, -1, I believe, and the balancing is around the +1, -1. But basically, yeah, if you're in a queue for too long in World of Tanks, it will stretch the already, some would say, stretched +2, -2. And again, this is kind of a historic thing. It goes back to when there were much fewer people playing World of Tanks, and the goal was to make matchmaking... There's my phone going. Oh, I keep doing this. Yeah, let me just turn that off. Back in the day, when there were fewer people playing, it made sense, because one of the goals of Wargaming's matchmaking system across all their games is to try and get people into a battle as fast as possible. So they made the rules a bit looser. And, you know, that made sense when there were few people playing. But these days, well, yeah, on some servers, okay, it might mean longer queue times. But on the EU and RU servers especially, you go on at pretty much any time of the day and there's tens of thousands of people playing. It's not a player-based issue anymore. There are enough people playing various kinds of tanks, and it's actually causing problems on the NA servers, because they've got NA East and NA West, and I can't remember which one's more populous, but one of them's very lightly populated indeed. But basically, the matchmaking there, and I don't know if it's still an issue, but it certainly was if you go back a month or two. In which case, I would imagine it still is. But basically, they didn't have enough newer players playing the lower tiers, and so you were getting lower tier games with only 5 or 10 players being put in, because matchmaking couldn't find enough people. And it's kind of like, the current +2, -2 sucks for a variety of reasons. Now, one of the reasons is that the balancing of individual tanks is incredibly variable. Like, even elited vehicles, 2 of the same tier can have a very, very different experience. Like, there are lots of tanks in the game where people will go, well, it's good when it's top tier, but yeah, so even +1 matchmaking, it suffers, and then you get +2 matchmaking and suddenly it feels absolutely terrible. Machines like the Churchill Mark 7, for instance. And okay, some of these could be fixed if you basically gave everybody guns good enough to fight that +2 tier matchmaking spread, but suddenly armor would be totally irrelevant. Like, if you had guns that are good enough to fight tanks 2 tiers higher than you all the time, then you better believe that those guns are going to be vastly overpowered when you're looking at tanks 2 tiers lower than you. So that doesn't really work as a solution. And that kind of variability in terms of like how much it can differ between various tanks, even of the same tier, well, it can make for a very, very inconsistent experience, even within tank lines on the same national tree. So I feel like there is a strong case for World of Tanks also having +1, -1, especially at the lower tiers. Now, another reason is stock tanks. There is no special matchmaking consideration for stock tanks. Like, you could be in a stock tier 6 and you're suddenly facing tier 8 tanks. In theory, there are sort of special rules where if you're in a tank you've just bought and it's stock for the first, I think it's like 10 battles, something like that. It's still a bit apocryphal. I mean, it's been officially actually confirmed, But my actual experience of it is that although in theory you're supposed to get special matchmaking for those first couple of battles, most of the time that's not the case. A lot of it depends when you're playing, what vehicles you're playing, and who's playing what at that particular time of day. But even so, like, you could even just have, based on what modules you've got, matchmaking rules based on that. And that's actually what another game does, Robocraft, and Circle's been playing that a little bit recently. But Robocraft, the actual composition of your vehicle affects what matchmakings you get. So that, even if you were going to do it that way, that would be a big improvement for World of Tanks, but you would also have to still balance a lot of individual vehicles. Whereas just general +1, -1 matchmaking will, it solves a lot of sins, and it's going to make the lower tier experience a lot better. Because I'm sure there are a lot of people that go to play this game and then they get to their first tier 3 tank and suddenly they're seeing KV1s and it's just like, well, I'm out. And I'd actually be interested to see what the dropout rate is for new players of World of Tanks, because you compare it to, this is the Glenfinnian Viaducts, by the way. This is the famous bit that you might recognise. In fact, if I hit that, I can do a bit of a zoom out. So I'm wondering, like, what the dropout rate is, because Wargaming have, in the past, what, 6, 8, 12 months, they've put a lot more emphasis on programs to retain existing players, and that makes me, you know, reading between the lines, that makes me think perhaps their take-up rate isn't as good, nearly as good as it used to be. And that's one of the things that would help Wargaming retain those customers, because people are likely to stick around if that, like, if you get over the hump of the lower tiers, whereas it's all very unpredictable and chaotic, and you start to get kind of tier 5 plus, and suddenly there's a little bit more thought going into what's going on, although tier 5 is still a bit Wild West. But it's very, like, at the moment, I just have this feeling that a lot of people are being put off, and that's why Wargaming is suddenly doing things like missions where you can unlock premium tanks, or referral programs, you know, stuff like this. So, yeah, at the moment, the +2, -2, like, the only way that is rewarding to players is if you're able to do damage. And if you're in a stock vehicle with the +2, -2, you know, your bottom tier, or you're just in a vehicle that scales up incredibly badly, like the Churchill's Mark 7, you don't get, there's no inherent reward for being bottom tier. If you can't damage the machines that you're facing, you're just screwed, you're just cannon fodder. You basically might as well not be there, you might as well just go AFK. And any game that basically turns around to you and says, well, you're just cannon fodder, just, you know, shut up and accept it, then that game has a bit of a problem. And I think it is a problem in World of Tanks. So that is my argument for +1, -1 in World of Tanks. I think it would be a good thing for the players. I think it'd be a good thing for Wargaming in terms of actually keeping those newer players that then might go on to spend money. Because I didn't spend money on this game until I'd played a good few thousand battles. Like, it took me a while to decide, okay, this is worth spending money on. How many potential customers is Wargaming losing? I don't know. But there are a number of, like, that is the ideal thing for me, like +1, -1. But even if they didn't do that, they could introduce limited matchmaking based on the state your vehicle's in. Like, so stock vehicles don't get as harsh matchmaking, or that you get an inherent reward for being bottom tier, because sometimes there is literally nothing you can do, and you're not going to get rewarded if you can't do the damage. So, yeah, I don't know. There's just, like, even if they don't go for full matchmaking tier reduction, there's still stuff they could do to make life easier. And the fact that Armored Warfare is doing that well, that's a really good thing, because it means they can balance their game with a lot more ease. At least I think so. And of course, having said all I've said about arty and matchmaking, like, the fact that Wargaming is at the stage it is at, and it's got all this kind of accumulated baggage at this point, and the weight of expectation of the player base, I'm thinking it's probably going to be a lot harder for them to make these changes, because Armored Warfare has the massive advantage of they can just do this from the very start, and they're still like this, it's still closed beta with Armored Warfare. They're still experimenting with this stuff. Some of it may change, but yeah, I think there's an opportunity here for Wargaming and watching what Armored Warfare is doing. It's not just like, I mean, I could go down the hyperbolic route of, oh my god, it's going to kill all the tanks. No, it's not. It's really not going to. Like, it might take away a bit of the player base, but it's not like this is an exclusive thing. People can play both if they want to, and a whole bunch of people are going to play both. The kind of killer question for Wargaming comes down to, well, where are people going to spend their money? So it's in their interest to, you know, be on their toes and pay attention to what Armored Warfare is doing, and actually look like they're responding and considering what the player base may or may not actually want. And I realise in an online game that's probably the hardest and most annoying thing, is because you just get constantly bombarded with different opinions. There's actually a really good I can't remember if it was Yes Minister or Yes Prime Minister, but Sir Humphrey Appleby, that arch bureaucrat, has a whole speech about like how he'd be like if he you know, ardently believed everything that every minister he worked for believed in, that he'd just be, you know, a complete self-contradictory mess. Well, it's probably a bit like that with online games. Like, trying to indulge the whim of every single player is functionally impossible. But if you get something like this, like Obsidian isn't making these changes out of nowhere. These are stuff that they've done for very specific reasons, because they feel like, well, if they can lure away some of the dissatisfied customer base of World of Tanks, you know, that alone will be enough to make their game a profitable game. So absolutely Wargaming should be paying attention, and absolutely they should be thinking about doing some of these things themselves. So lastly, I promised you 3, the RNG spread. In World of Tanks it's plus minus 25 either way, and in Armored Warfare it's 10% either way. So this, I'm a bit more on the fence about this one. Like the previous two, yes, I'd like to see artilleries changed, and yes, I'd like to see the matchmaking spread changed. In this one, well, honestly, we're actually going to stop the train here, because if I stop it at the platform, the scenario ends at that point. I should have picked a longer scenario. Inevitably, I started blathering for longer than I thought I would. The RNG spread as it is, like the very simplistic arguments are that a tighter RNG spread rewards skill a bit more, and it leads to less kind of outlier results, basically. Now, there's actually 2 different kind of parts of this. You've got your actual, like, when we think of the RNG and the plus minus 25%, it's the penetration and the damage that we're thinking of. The aim circle works a bit differently, and we don't actually know what the aim spread, the exact mechanics for that in Armored Warfare are. Although, if they have been posted, I haven't seen them. Like, I might have just missed them. But what I'm specifically talking about here is the plus minus 25%. And it can lead to, like, I feel like the reason it is plus minus 25 is to help the less skilled players get by. And this is why I'm kind of on the fence. Like, I can see why Wargaming's done it. A tighter spread will reward player skill. It will give you less unpredictable results. But the looser spread gives, let's say, less skilled players a better chance against more skilled players. It kind of, like, it hurts it in terms of stuff like esports, but in terms of making the game the equally unpredictable experience for everybody, well, you can kind of see why they've done it. Now, the one thing I would like to see changed, actually, if they were going to change any RNG at all, it would be to do with penetration, because at the moment, damage is it's a very visible thing. Like, you can see the damage rolls that you're doing, and it's very kind of like, you know roughly how much you're going to do with your gun, and then you know roughly how much either side of that it can go. And sometimes RNG can and will straight up screw you out of wins. But it's visible, at least. You know, you hit somebody for a below average damage roll, and then they go and kill you and win the match. Well, that's irritating, but at least it's visible. At least you can see what happened. With the penetration RNG, it's basically invisible. You can't tell if you've rolled high or rolled low. And sometimes you think, okay, I've shot somebody, that's a guaranteed shot. It's definitely going to pen, and then it bounces, and you think, was that an armor bounce? Was that a low pen roll? I mean, you can't tell. That entire side of the game is invisible. And I can't honestly think of a way that you would make it visible. Like, that's a kind of a tough thing. But I honestly feel like at the moment, especially, well, even somebody like me that's played a lot of battles, not as many as, you know, someone like Fosh, but compared to the average World of Tanks players, like, I've played over, is it 22,000, 23,000 at this point? More than most, anyway. I'm in the top percentile of players in terms of battle played. It's actually, like, it can be really obscure sometimes. You can't tell whether something's gonna pen or not. I would actually like to see a tighter RNG spread on penetration, a much tighter RNG spread. I'm kind of okay with damage being how it is, but pen, just because it's so opaque, it's really frustrating when you need to pen a shot and then I mean, especially with some of the premium tanks that have worse guns for their tiers, like things like the IS-6, and you'll be fighting a tier 7 heavy and you'll pen them twice in a row and you need to pen the third shot and then it bounces 3 times in a row because either you bounced off their armor or you just got 3 low rolls in terms of the pen, and that's entirely possible, but you can't tell. So I feel like it'd be nicer if that penetration RNG especially was a lot tighter, so that you know what you can pen, you know reliably what tanks that you are going to get, and if you do bounce off, then you know that generally speaking it's going to be because you hit their armor at an auto bounce angle. It's not because you got an invisible low RNG roll on the penetration. So that's a thing I'd like to see changed, and maybe not a global change. I'm kind of more okay with the damage rolls, but even so, I suppose it would be nice if that was even like 20% as opposed to 25% or something like that. So these are all things that, like, I'm expecting a bit of discussion under this video. You know, this is my own opinions and thoughts, having played this game a bunch. And if you've played the game for more battles than I have, maybe you'll have different thoughts. If you've only played it for a couple of hundred battles, maybe you'll be coming at it from a different perspective. So I'm kind of like, I'm hoping that there will be some interesting discussion in the comments section, and that it won't all just be, oh, OMG, you're just so wrong, just go in the corner and be wrong over there so we don't have to listen to you being wrong. Well, you know, there are always going to be some of those comments, but hopefully not too many of them anyway. So yeah, that was my topic of discussion. It seemed like a good time to do it because I've been playing Armoured Warfare a bit, and I've been playing World of Tanks a bit, but a bit less recently. And even though I've said I've not been, like, Armoured Warfare hasn't massively grabbed me, I still like the things that it's doing. And as I've said in previous videos, I like the fact that there is competition for World of Tanks. I like the fact that Wargaming has to actually suddenly consider some of these things seriously, because if they don't, it might come round to bite them in the ass quite seriously. So yes, comments, try and keep it civil, please. I'm sure some people will ignore my plea, but anyway, you can leave any below. If you liked this video, even if you just liked this sexy train, I mean, my god, look at it, it's just whoa. You can hit the like button. You can, of course, subscribe to my channel. If you want to see more train simulator stuff, well, you know, let me know. I've no idea how I'd make it into a video, but I'd maybe think of something. And as always, stay tuned for more.